Hello. Today's episode is entitled Separate and Unequal. In 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed and the Civil War ended, President Lincoln and subsequently his successor, Andrew Johnson, attempted to reconstruct the South and restore it to normalcy as quickly as possible post-Civil War. This turbulent period of Reconstruction was also designed to protect the recently freed slaves and to assimilate them into society as seamlessly as possible. As a result of radical Reconstruction, which was enforced by the U.S. Army, over 1,500 African Americans from 1867 to 1877 were elected to government office in record numbers, including P.B.S. Pinchback, who was governor of Louisiana, Oscar James Dunn, Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana from 1868 to 1871. Robert Smalls, South Carolina Representative, South Carolina Senator, as well as U.S. Representative. And Jonathan Jasper Wright, who was elected to the South Carolina Supreme Court in 1870 and served for 7 years. With the passage of the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, Congress demanded that all new state governments re-entering the Union must disfranchise all high-ranking Confederates. Moreover, this act temporarily suspends the ability to vote for approximately 10,000 to 15,000 white men who had been Confederate officials or senior officers, while the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments simultaneously granted freedom for citizenship and voting rights, respectively, to the former slaves. But the tide was turned in 1877, when Northerners had grown tired of managing this peacekeeping operation. A backroom deal was struck between Rutherford B. Hayes and the Republicans, and they secured the presidency for Hayes. But in return, the North turned a blind eye towards how blacks were treated in the South, which included the removal of all federal troops, changing things for the freed black men and women. The Ku Klux Klan, established in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, and other paramilitary groups used terror, extreme violence, and intimidation tactics to drive African Americans back to the plantation. The goal was to reassert white supremacy and to restore their Southern economy, which for 2 centuries had been predicated upon the free labor of blacks. Shortly before the turn of the century in 1900, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the separate but equal doctrine, which would become the way of life in the U.S. for the next 58 years. During these moments in history, what was the position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, particularly its leadership? Did they embrace this racist, oppressive philosophy, or did the remnant church offer equity and fairness to all its constituents? This is the question that we will address in this episode. Here to share his expertise on the subject matter is Dr. Calvin B. Rock, former president of Oakwood University and former vice president of the General Conference. Here's that interview. Even though we are going to focus on the period from about 1909, 1910, from the start of the Negro Department to about 1943, I do want to go back just a little bit. There's something historical that took place in 1896. I'm not referring to the establishment of the Oakwood Training School, but there was a landmark court decision that was rendered in 1896. You know it well. You refer to it in your dissertation. It was Plessy versus Ferguson that absolutely changed the landscape in America, both in secular society and, unfortunately, it had a tremendous impact on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Let me ask you, what impact did this landmark case have on society at large?
It simply validated, I think, what was already going on. That is the separation, the physical separation outside of the intimacies that were had in terms of black people working in white folks' houses that spoke really to the fact that other than that, the races were not supposed to mingle. They had an expression that later came out in Martin Luther King Jr.'s day that said, in those days and for a long time afterward, down in the South, white people didn't care how close you got, just don't get too big. And up north of us, we don't care how big you get, just don't get too close. But at that point, it was, you can wash our dishes and feed our babies and clean our houses and get close. But we don't want, and we don't need, and we don't think it's right for the races to mingle. Now, of course, that wasn't everybody.
Right.
We don't think it's right for the races to mingle on an everyday basis in a common way. There were those, as I said, who didn't function like that, but that was the majority feeling. And the separate but equal Plessy versus Ferguson legislation simply codified and gave it legal expression.
How can we compare or contrast how society treated African Americans in general with how we were treated by Caucasian Seventh-day Adventists in the Adventist Church? Is there a comparison or a contrast?
Good question. There was little contrast. The church has historically, in its social relations, followed the lead of the nation. In other words, if the nation has said separate but equal, the church said, okay, separate but equal. And later on, when that was repealed, the church also began to change, but very, very slowly. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was the 65th denomination to come out and validate the Civil Rights Act.
6'5".
Yeah, there was, of course, maybe at that time 200 churches in the nation, but we certainly were not the head.
Right.
In fact, some folk would say we were closer to the
tail.
But that is to say that we have been very, very timid in this regard. We had been, and I guess to some extent today, some people still are, but it's changed greatly. Because of certain statements that Ellen White made. One, in 1908, when she said, let us be careful, because if in the South, and she did say South, blacks and whites mingle, it'll make it hard for whites to minister. And she was later repeated over and over again by other white leaders, but they left out the fact that she designated caution in the South. Of course, the principle should have been applied everywhere. But she was specific when she said in the South. And instead of being cautious just in the South, where the prejudices were deepest, it was endemic to the nation, in terms of how whites felt they should relate to blacks. So with what Ellen White's statement misapplied, in my opinion, and with what the nation was doing, it was a matter of, with conscience, not allowing the two races to come together in churches or in institutions, in schools. Or if a black were to go to some Adventist school of higher education, maybe one or two, just a quota. But there was extreme caution, and it was based upon what Ellen White was misquoted as saying.
Absolutely.
Although her principle should be understood. And the fact that this is what the nation was doing, and Paul says in Romans that we should honor governments. God sets them up. There were all kinds of arguments used to keep us apart.
Tell me if you are at all surprised at the frankness and honesty of Ellen White about the race issue. Listen to this comment. I read this in your dissertation. Sin rests upon us as a church because we have not made greater effort for the salvation of souls among the colored people. It will always be a difficult matter to deal with the prejudices of the white people in the South and do missionary work for the colored race. But the way this matter has been treated by some is an offense to God. You have no license from God to exclude the colored people in your places of worship. Treat them as Christ's property, which they are, just as much as yourselves. They should hold membership in the church with the white brethren. Every effort should be made to wipe out the terrible wrong which has been done them.
Do you have a date for that? Is there a date which is stated in the footnote?
I don't have the date, but I just have Southern Work, page 15.
Okay, if I'm not mistaken, that was written before she said, let the whites work for the whites and blacks work for the blacks.
Gotcha.
Actually, after Separate but Equal in 1896 and other incidents, riots and so forth, that occurred following that, she, and segregation hardened. After she said what you just wrote, segregation hardened, and she came back and said, but wait a minute, let the blacks work with the blacks and the whites work for the whites. And that seemed to contrast what she had said earlier.
Right.
But it was reasonable.
It was.
Given the fact that, well, like in the days of Christ, people say Jesus never railed against Rome. Had he railed against Rome, it would have aborted his mission. He would have been crucified long before Calvary. He could not come out and criticize Rome and continue to lead his little fledgling church. Neither could the Seventh-day Adventist Church come out and be seen as integrationist.
It could not have.
Conflicting, conflicting with the rules of the government. That would, remember, we had hundreds, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of members, and maybe a few thousand.
Right.
By 1900, we had just, 100 blacks, and several hundred whites, a few thousand. So that the church was in no position to be seen as contradicting the law, although, again, she had said earlier, if you see a runaway slave, in spite of the law of the land that says you got to turn him back, don't do so. She advocated civil disobedience. But what I'm trying to get at is that at each point in history, Ellen White's attitude and advice was as liberal and as just as the circumstances could accommodate. And she had balance, but she never meant that her cautions in not exciting prejudices was to be carried ad infinitum on into the future, even when the laws changed and the cultures opened up and circumstances reversed themselves.
Would you agree that it is because of this book, The Southern Work, that many individuals, even some African Americans, and I'm quite surprised at that, view her as a racist because of her comments in this book?
If they read Southern Work right, they could never view her as a racist. In fact, she comes out more like a radical liberal over and over again. Her statements are very, very condemnatory toward slavery, toward prejudice, toward racism, toward favoritism, and toward every evil of a social nature. She was a social liberal and a soul sister.
Absolutely. The creation of the Negro Department in 1909
you stated was affected by, I'm quoting, the increasing demands of black Adventists and the concomitant, or the simultaneous rise of anxiety among their white counterparts. What were the demands of the black leaders in and around 1909?
Well, beginning in 1889, when we had our first recorded protest from C.M.
Kinney.
Who after a camp meeting in Kentucky, as I recall, protested
Right.
and said, it's a shame you're forcing black people to sit in the back and live in lesser quarters and so forth. After that first protest, there was a continued effort, and I am not an expert on the research of those years in between, but the way you read the history, there was a continued push for integration, or desegregation might be a better word for it. And a clamor for some inclusion in administrative events. So that's what finally led, the brethren said finally in 1909, which is when we had less than 200 black members in the church, less than 200 black members.
Sure.
We will get a department that will attend to their peculiar needs. And they appointed 3 whites in succession to handle that job between 1909 and 1918. You got it. And in 1918, they appointed the first black.
W.H. Green.
That's true.
Why, in your opinion, white men to handle a black office?
Why did they think white men could handle
a black office? Yes, yeah.
Because they're just the divine right of the privileged. There was no
To do so.
rational reason, but the thinking that they probably knew what was best and didn't know who to trust in terms of what they call trust. So they did what was natural. Paternalism was very much alive.
Sure. 1918, there's a change.
Yes.
W.H. Green becomes the first head of the Negro Department.
Right.
Am I free to read into the fact that there were some issues developing, maybe with the white leadership that they weren't comfortable with, that necessitated a change? Why did the change take place?
I think there was pressure from blacks to get a black in there. Again, I've never read the minutes. I have minutes for some other things that happened later, but those minutes I've never seen. But again, the feeling of history or the reading of history in that era suggests that black leaders were not happy and were uncomfortable with white leadership of their affairs,
Sure.
as small as they were, and they wanted black leadership. And finally the brethren acquiesced and put in a black man.
From 1918 to approximately 1944, that same department was headed by the likes of W.H. Green from 1918-1928, G.E. Peters, 1929 to 1930, and again from 1941 to 1953, Frank L. Peterson from 1930 to 1941. He had a second stint from 51 to 62. Elder C.E. Mosley, my teacher here at Oakwood, 1 year from 53 to 54. H.D. Singleton from 62 to 75. The Righteous Rebel, W.W. Fordham, from 75 to 78. What kind of impact, Dr. Rock, did these men have on the department and on the black work in general? And how indebted are we to those men and the leadership that they provided to the black church, most of which took place during the Jim Crow era, which was an era of separate and unequal in society at large and in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in particular? How indebted today are we to those men?
We are profoundly indebted to them. Profoundly. Because they had to not just give leadership to the growing black work, and it was growing then rapidly. By 1944, we had approximately 17,000 members, up from the 100 in 1900, and slightly more than that in 1909. So these men, from whatever it was in 1918, I'm not recalling precisely, but they had to work the system
Yeah.
in our behalf.
Absolutely.
And they had to do it with lesser materials and amenities and accommodations. The reason for Brother Green's death, the first secretary, at age 47, is that he got sick as a result of his system being not shut down, but worn down, traveling and eating and sleeping in difficult situations. It is believed. It is believed. Remember in those days, and even when I came along, which was later, I entered to work in 52, but before, and things had changed somewhat since then,
Okay.
but before that, remember, and as I said, even when my generation came along, you didn't have hotels in which to sleep when you traveled. You had to go to a city, and in some big towns they may have had one black hotel or one black housing unit where everybody knew across the country. You knew when you got to Chattanooga or
Right.
wherever, there was this place where you stayed. But for the most part, you slept in your car. You couldn't eat at restaurants. You could go in the back door or the side door, and that was not the most pleasant way to get your food.
Sure.
And you slept on trains and buses. You traveled without Marriotts and Hiltons, yeah, and Red Roofs even, or Motel 6s. If you got sleepy, you either pull off the side of the road and slept and hope nobody would bother you, or you got out and shook yourself and stretched and got back in your car and drove another hour.
Wow.
And that wore down on the brethren. And many of them died very young.
Did they?
They died young. Many of them died young. And there's a reward for people like that in glory,
Absolutely.
I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But that's what they had to go through. And even when they were in the office at home, they could not eat in the general conference cafeteria. They were in the same building with other offices. Their office was, but they couldn't eat in the cafeteria. They had to bring brown bags and sit in their own office, and they were excluded from other affairs and events that brought some degree of status and comfort to their colleagues. So we owe them more than they knew, or we can say, for suffering through those conditions, riding the rails, as it were,
Absolutely.
for whatever periods of time they were in office, and at the same time trying to corral the interests of black folk. And that's another story, which isn't always easy either.
Sure.
Trying to get black folk to agree and go along together. So you asked the question, what kind of debt do we owe them? We owe them a great debt of gratitude.
Amen. Amen. We now have regional conferences, and they have been a tremendous blessing in the black work. But that was not our original intention. The brethren back then wanted, and rightly so, wanted integration. How was that request and that desire on their part met by the leadership of the church back in those days, back in the teens, in the 20s, and those way back in those days? How was that met?
The first push for integration that was made was that of Kinney's. When Kinney pushed in 1889, he wanted inclusion.
Right.
In the early 90s, there was a push for inclusion. Even after 1900s, even after 1819, when we got a black secretary, there was still a hope for inclusion. The sermons, the literature tell us. In the late 20s, it peaked with J.K. Humphrey in New York, and the Manns brothers. In fact, even before that, In the teens, there was Pastor Sheaf, Elder Louis Sheaf, who pushed in the Washington, D.C. area for inclusion. He finally got disgusted and went out on his own. But there was, within the system, a consistent push for inclusion. And that was all really black people thought about.
Absolutely.
Inclusion. They didn't have any sense of, until the late 20s, they didn't express any sense of accommodated organizations or organizational accommodations. But in the late 20s, Sheaf and the Man's Brothers and others made direct appeals which were rebuffed. Several of these men went out and started their own churches. And the church, having denied their request, suspecting them and accusing them of being power hungry and angry radicals, moved on. And from 1930 to 1943, when the administration offered black conferences to us, which you know, I trust. We did not get black conferences because there was a banging at the door and an appeal, and the brethren said yes. They said no in 28 to 30.
Right.
But some things happened between 30 and 43 that caused the brethren to come back to us and offer these conferences to us.
Exactly.
In fact, Elder Peterson, Frank L. Peterson, who wrote the book The Hope of the Race, that was published in 1934, which was the first of black publications that I know about, is quoted to have said, and I have a manuscript that includes this that's coming out soon, I hope. He said that when they were told in the late 30s or in the early 30s, or the year 30, that there would be no black conferences, they were told never to bring it up again. Don't ever bring it up again. And it seems as if the brethren didn't, not that they didn't want them.
They acquiesced?
I don't think they acquiesced. They just didn't see any openings, I guess. Now, they may have talked about it privately, but I am not aware of any minutes or documents where they expressed it. But some things happened. One of the things that happened, of course, is the Lucy Byard incident in 1943, when this black Adventist was refused service at Washington Sanitarium, now Washington Hospital in D.C., and died at Freedman's Hospital. She was a light-skinned black woman, and when they discovered in the Adventist hospital that she was black, they sent her to the colored hospital, and she died. And that infuriated particularly the Washington, D.C. black members. And they raised a big hullabaloo. And the white brothers sent over a white preacher to conciliate them, and his sermon was,
he just made it worse.
Think it not strange when you're called upon to endure fiery trials. And that just made it worse.
Oh, man.
And so a lot of papers were fired off, the brethren were confronted. That was one issue. Another issue was what was going on at what was then Emmanuel Missionary Training School or College, which is now EMC.
Right.
It was Washington Seminary. Anyway, the names were different. But students were beginning to complain loudly then, and they were heard by a man named Claude Barnett, who was the editor of the black newspapers of that era. He died in the 60s, but he was a very, very prominent spokesman for black issues, black people, and he had a particular tack of questioning religious organizations. He was into what the Catholics were doing, and the Episcopalians and the Baptists, and he found out about Adventism at what is now Andrews University, and he wrote in some of the black newspapers about it. He put big headlines about what was going on at this Emmanuel Missionary School, and that was very embarrassing for the church. And that is a second of several things that happened in that 13-year period between rejection and the offering of regional conferences. And it was in the atmosphere, the wake of these incidents, that Elder McElhaney, who was president of the General Conference, called the Black Brothers together with the encouragement of Elder Peters,
Right.
who was the regional secretary at that time, and said, look, we want to meet with the Black Brothers. And they were brought together, and the General Conference president, with several of his officers, offered regional conferences to the Black Brothers. And they said, well, they didn't all say yes, by the way. Many of them said, no, that's not godly. That's separation.
Right.
We want unity. We want the status quo.
Our brothers said that?
Our brothers.
Our brothers.
Our brothers. I have the quotes. It's in my book that's titled Protest and Progress, the three major freedom endeavors of black Seventh-day Adventists in the 20th century. It's now in the hands of the Review, that book. But I have the minutes. By the way, my wife was archivist here at Oakwood, where we're doing this interview, for 12 years. And she saved some valuable minutes for me.
Awesome.
And among those minutes is I have the quotes of the different ministers. I have their names. And I didn't use all their names because some of their children are still living.
Right.
And I'm not going to embarrass them. They might be, they might not be, but I'm not taking that chance.
Sure.
Actually said, no, we don't want black conferences. We want to improve where we are. And they were sincere. They probably felt that was capitulation. They probably felt that was capitulation. But others, and I give credit from my reading to G.E. Peters for pushing it, and the man who moved that we proceed to do regional conferences is a Pastor McLeod, who's in the Palmer family.
Okay.
Pastor McLeod said, I moved that we proceed to study this issue. He broke the logjam, and then the others who had said they were skeptical fell in line, and that was the beginning of the deliberations that finally came out with the recommendation that supported what the GC president and others were offering, black conferences.
In closing, even though Ellen White consistently issued a clarion call to do the right thing as it relates to slavery and the race issue, the Seventh-day Adventist Church did not initially heed her counsel. Racist policies and practices were established that supported the separation of the races, thus creating challenges for the leaders seeking to grow the black work. A few of the more prominent African American pastors chafed at the inequality and unfairness of these policies. Not only did Lewis C. Sheaf, J.K. Humphrey, and J.W. Mann leave the denomination themselves, but sadly, Pastors Humphrey and Mann took their congregations with them, never to return, because their pleas for racial equity consistently fell on deaf ears. After leaving the denomination, J.W. Mann described the Adventist Church in the following manner. He says, I quote, "Because bigoted white leaders among Seventh-day Adventists have failed to consider the necessity of such vital changes, but have fixed a permanent bar against the Negro leadership in the organization, many of the most intelligent Negro ministers are separated from the denomination, some of whom have become entirely disgusted and have sought other positions such as doctors of medicine and chiropractic. Others have resorted to real estate speculation, and still others in the farm, etc. It is also true that many have given up the Christian hope and are looking to the cold world from which there can be no lasting peace of mind," end quote. While it is most unfortunate that a number of African American men and women concluded that they had no other recourse than to disassociate themselves from the remnant church because of its racial inequities, it goes without saying that we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to those who remained and endured and paved the way for those who would come behind them and see a better day. I am deeply indebted to Dr. Rock, for most of the information I referenced was gleaned from his doctoral dissertation from Vanderbilt University entitled Institutional Loyalty versus Racial Freedom, The Dilemma of Black Seventh-day Adventist Leadership. In the near future, I will make this dissertation available via our website. It is a must-read for all Seventh-day Adventists. I now leave you with this quote from Ellen White. She says, "If a red man, a Chinaman, or an African gives his heart to God in obedience and faith, Jesus loves him nonetheless for his color. He calls him his well-beloved brother. The day is coming when the kings and the lordly men of the earth would be glad to exchange places with the humblest African who was laid hold on the hope of the gospel." End quote. Thank you, and continue to pray for us here in the Allegheny East Conference as we continue our series entitled, "Are We Still Relevant? A critical look at regional conferences, past, present, and future." Be blessed, and I'll see you.